didn't sleep like us, not even close. Imagine a world lit only by fire, a world where night meant true, complete darkness. Where silence wasn't broken by distant traffic or the dull hum of appliances, but by wolves howling, owls screeching, or the shifting of heavy wooden beams in a cold stone house. Now imagine waking up in the middle of the night not because of a nightmare, or insomnia, or too much coffee, but because it was normal, expected, even prescribed. This was first sleep. And after that came the second. Yes, two separate sleeps. Medieval people, across much of Europe, regularly woke in the middle of the night, not in confusion, but as part of their routine. They would sleep for 4 hours or so, wake up for an hour or two, then sleep again until dawn. And in that in-between period, a kind of secret world unfolded. People prayed, they tended to livestock, they lit candles and read scriptures. They talked, they made love, they reflected on dreams, or even wandered outside beneath the moonlight. It was quiet, peaceful, a liminal space between waking and sleeping that modern people rarely experience anymore. The historian Roger Eckertz would later rediscover this pattern buried in diaries, legal testimonies, and letters. It wasn't an oddity, it was the norm, a hidden rhythm of rest, broken only by the mechanical regularity of modern life centuries later. But this was only the beginning of the strangeness, because if you were a peasant sleeping in a longhouse with your animals or a noblewoman wrapped in furs in a drafty manner, you didn't tea-sleep the way you imagined either. Beds were shared, often with family, or servants, or travelers, sometimes even with strangers. Privacy in the modern sense was an alien concept. And if you think sleeping on a mattress was standard, think again. Straw pallets were common, but not the soft kind. These were scratchy, flattened bags stuffed with hay, rushes, or bracken. Over time, fleas, lice, and dampness collected inside, which people tried to beat out with sticks or replace seasonally. Only the wealthiest had feather beds, and even those could become infested without regular airing. And yet people slept. They slept with doors unbarred and animals at their feet. They slept by candlelight under heavy wool, with dreams influenced not by screens, but by the crackling of a hearth or the whisper of wind under the eaves. Sleep back then was different, but it was not always restful, because night carried danger too. There were fears real and imagined that walked in the dark. In rural villages, people whispered of spirits who visited sleepers. The Alp, a demonic creature of Germanic lore, was said to press on one's chest during sleep, suffocating them. Sound familiar? That's because this is the historical cousin of what we now call sleep paralysis. In Slavic folklore, witches were thought to fly at night, slipping through keyholes to steal breath from sleeping infants. In England, it was the mare, a wicked presence that rode upon the sleeperess chest and gave us our modern word, nightmare. So beds were often protected not just by blankets, but by charms. A sprig of rosemary hung by the window, prayer etched into the bedframe, shoes turned upside down beneath the bed. All little shields against the things that lurked beyond the firelight. And for those who lived in monasteries or abbeys, sleep was a sacrament, igulated, rationed, sacred. Monks and nuns followed canonical hours, which divided the night into holy segments. They were awoken by bells at midnight to chant prayers in unison, then allowed to return to their beds until matins or lauds, just before dawn. Their sleep was humble, simple pallets, no pillows, often clothed. Sleep was not an indulgence, it was something to be endured in service of the soul. Yet even among the pious, sleep held mystery. Dreams, for instance, were deeply significant. Not just odd fragments of memory, but messages, visions, warnings. In medieval dream books, manuscripts used to interpret the symbolism of dreams, people found meaning in everything. Dream of teeth falling out. Expect death in the family. Dream of being chased. Your sins are catching up with you. Even kings consulted dream interpreters before major decisions. It was believed that the veil between this world and the divine was thinnest in the sleeping hours. So sleep became both a portal and a battleground. But the sleep of royalty, too, was strange. Take the example of Henry VIII. His bed was enormous, made of oak, and carved with sacred inscriptions, draped in velvet and guarded by servants. Yet he often slept alone, despite his many marriages. Royal sleep was a performance, like everything else. It had ritual. Ceremonial going to bed involved public undressing, prayers, the giving of wine, the closing of bed curtains before being left to rest in privacy. If privacy could ever be said to exist in a court full of spies and servants, the idea of bedrooms as we understand them didn't truly exist yet. Even in noble houses, the chamber was more than a bedroom. It was a multifunctional space where servants might sleep on floors, where officials might enter at dawn to report to their lord, where letters were written by candlelight. And while nobles slept on beds, the poor often made do with simple benches, hearthside straw, or even shared barn corners with animals for warmth. But cold was not the only enemy. Fires were a deadly risk. People feared falling asleep with candles still burning. Whole towns, made of timber and thatch, could vanish in a single night. So bedtime routines included careful snuffing of flames, checking of hearths, and the placing of metal fire guards. Some even slept in shifts, especially during times of fear or war, to ensure someone was always awake, always alert. And in castles, those cold, echoing stone keep servants might be roused at any hour to tend to fires or fetch hot bricks to warm the master's bed. And there's more, far more. A man with a lantern. He walks the perimeter of a walled village under a cloudless sky, the stars wheeling above him in their ancient silent dance. It is the 14th century, and he is not sleeping. He is one of the few who are awake. The job of the town watch, called the ronds de nuit in France or night wardens in English towns, was to patrol the streets, while others slept. They weren't just guarding against thieves or drunkards, but fire, which was an ever-present nightmare in medieval towns packed with wooden buildings and open hearths. These watchmen carried poles, bells, or horns to signal danger. Their voices might have been the only sound in the small hours. A low chant of the hour, a call that all was well. And so, the night wasn't truly silent. It had its own rhythm, its own watchers. Meanwhile, in rural villages, sleep was shaped by something else entirely: the land. Fieldwork dictated when one rested. In summer, days were long and nights short. In winter, darkness came early, and people spent far more time indoors. The hearth became the center of not only heat, but social life. Evening was when stories were told, fables, folklore, gossip, and song. In many households, people didn't have individual bedrooms, let alone beds. The family, sometimes extended, slept together on mattresses or straw piles laid across the floor. Children nestled beside grandparents, a dog curled near the feet. The room was dense with the smell of smoke, sweat, wool, and garlic hung to dry in rafters. Sometimes lodgers or visitors were welcome to sleep at the foot or by the fire, especially if they brought news, tools, or tales. Sleep was communal, and it was often interrupted. A baby's cry, a pot rattling as it cooled. It's the wind knocking against a shutter. But in this world, interrupted sleep wasn't seen as a disorder. In fact, medical texts of the time often assumed the two-part sleep pattern. They advised different prayers for the first and second sleep. They even suggested activities best done in the watching hour, between them, like conception. Yes, according to some medieval doctors, the in-between time after first sleep was the most fruitful for creating children. The mind was relaxed, the body warm, the house quiet. Now imagine this same rhythm unfolding in a different setting: a noble estate, a castle, or a manor. Here, the tapestries on the walls weren't just decorative, they helped trap heat. Beds were raised not for luxury, but for insulation higher off the ground, meant further from drafts and scuttling vermin. Bedchambers had canopies and thick drapes more for warmth and privacy than for elegance. And still, it was rare to sleep alone. Even the wealthiest shared their space with servants, guards, or companions. The concept of solitude in sleep, one person, one room, one bed, was almost unheard of. That would come centuries later with the rise of the individualist domestic space during the Enlightenment. In the medieval world, the night was not private, it was shared. Shared sleep had its own etiquette. When traveling, for example, it wasn't strange for men to share a bed in inns or taverns. It was expected. Space was limited, and bedding was scarce. What might seem strange now was once unremarkable. People even brought their own sheets or blankets when staying elsewhere. Inns might provide the frame. But bedding was a personal, precious commodity, often infested, patched and scented by years of use. But while the poor shared floors and the rich shared chambers, there was one place where sleep was truly strange: the convent. Inside the cloister, sleep was rigid, regulated, and tightly controlled. Nuns might rise at midnight or 3 a.m., depending on the order, to chant the divine office. They slept fully clothed, often on straw. Pillows were discouraged. Too much comfort was seen as indulgent. And yet, even in their austerity, nuns found moments of nocturnal peace. Some left behind writings describing dreams of angels, visions of light, or nights spent in a serene haze of prayer and sleep. And then there were the more unusual cases. Take the story of Margery Kempe, an English Christian mystic in the 15th century. She described nights where she was kept awake by divine ecstasies, sobbing, trembling, seeing visions of Christ. Her neighbors thought her mad. Her confessor feared for her soul. But to Margery, these sleepless nights were a gift, a visitation, crossing of the veil between this world and the next. Others were not so lucky. In the margins of medieval court records, there are mentions of women who couldn't sleep, who cried through the night, claimed they were being visited by spirits or attacked by invisible demons. Some were brought before priests for exorcism. Others were treated with herbal remedies, valerian, poppy syrup, lavender, but more often they were simply ignored or blamed. Sleep, you see, was not just a biological necessity. It was a moral one. Too much sleep was sloth, too little a sign of guilt, or sin, or possession. And thus, how one slept became a reflection of who one was. But the strangest detail of all? It may be this: sleep wasn't always nighttime. In summer, when the sun rose before 5 a.m. and didn't set until late, people often napped during the day. Laborers paused in the heat for a rest. Monks practiced brief repose in the afternoon, and nobles took their leisure sprawled on daybeds in sun-drenched chambers. They called it a short sleeping, or in Latin, siesta bruis. Day sleep, like night sleep, had its own rules. You shouldn't eat too heavily before it. You should not lie on your back. You should not sleep with your mouth open for fear that spirits might creep in. Even dreams during naps were seen as more prophetic. One record tells of a Flemish baker who fell asleep beside his oven and dreamed of a great flood. He awoke and told the village. 2 weeks later, the river rose and the town was submerged. His dream was recorded in a parish chronicle divine warning via dozing. Strange, yes, but maybe not so different from now. Because deep down, the human need for rest hasn't changed. The way we build it, name it, fear it, or seek it, those things shift. But sleep itself, that ancient surrender, is timeless, and still full of secrets. The fire has burned low now. The animals have quieted. The air is cold, but still. Somewhere, perhaps in a timbered cottage nestled against the edge of a forest, a mother begins to hum, not to herself, but to her child, rocking gently on a straw-stuffed mat. The lullabies of the Middle Ages weren't always sweet. Some were haunting. Others were warnings disguised as song. And many, if you listened closely, held within them the deep fears of a world constantly brushing against illness, famine, and war. The popular lullaby in the 14th century went like this: "Lulay, lulay, little child, why dost thou weep so sore? Need must thou weep. It is thy kind thou wast born to suffer more." Imagine whispering that to a baby. But it wasn't meant to frighten. It was meant to prepare, to reflect the world's hardness. Medieval people, especially the poor, understood that life was rarely gentle, so they wove truth into their cradles, songs truth, and a strange kind of comfort. Because even in sorrow, there is ritual. And even in darkness, there is song. Sleep wasn't just for restoration. It was a time of transition, and the night carried its own spiritual weight. That's why some children were given protective objects to sleep with. A wax cross, saint's medallion, even a piece of bread with a holy mark. These were thought to ward off evil spirits or nightmares. Sleep was vulnerable. To sleep was to surrender your body, your breath, your awareness. And so parents watched. They whispered prayers. They hung sprigs of herbs above the bed. Vervain for protection, mugwort for vivid dreams, chamomile for peace. And then there were the saints. Yes, Saints had dominion over the sleeping hours. Saint Raphael was the protector of travelers and often invoked for peaceful sleep during long journeys. Saint Joseph, gentle and silent, was believed to watch over dreamers his own dreams, having once saved the Holy Family from Herod's wrath and for nightmares. You might appeal to Saint Apollonia or Saint Dymphna, patrons of those afflicted by anxiety and mental affliction. Their relics were said to soothe the restless mind. In some villages, particularly in France and Italy, people left offerings at chapels, feathers from pillows, bits of straw, or little carved cradles, hoping to earn a night of rest free from the devil's whisper. Because sleep was never just physical, it was moral, spiritual, sometimes even political. In monasteries, if a monk was found dozing during prayer, it was considered a grave fault. In courts, falling asleep at the wrong moment could be interpreted as insult or treason. Even among common folk, sleeping through a bellwether for prayer, fire, or feast was cause for gossip or ridicule. But people also loved their sleep. They craved it. They built rituals around it. They fought for it. There is a record of a 15th century woman in Yorkshire who sued her neighbor for disturbing her sleep with loud late-night songs. Her argument, that restful nights were her right as a God-fearing widow, she won. And then there were the dreams.
Oh, the dreams.
They were everywhere in poetry and sermons and court documents, because dreams were not just internal. They were messages, visitations, sometimes even prophecies. A bishop once dreamed of a lion walking through his garden. Next week he fell gravely ill. He believed the lion was death. He recovered, but never slept alone again. A midwife in Saxony dreamed of a woman screaming beside a river. The next day she found a drowned traveler. She claimed the dream was a call from beyond to prepare her for a soul's passing.
Oh.
Even ordinary dreams were recorded with care. A farmer wrote in his ledger that he dreamed of apples falling from the sky. That year the harvest was bountiful. Dreams were as real as waking life, sometimes more so. But what about the dreamless? People feared them. To wake with no memory of sleep was, for some, a bad omen. A sign that you had not been visited by angels or guided by spirits. And so, before bed, some people drank potions not to sleep, but to dream. Mixtures of poppy, wine, crushed fennel, and honey, a draught known to open the night mind. Others recited specific psalms backwards, believing it would unlock visions. And in the deepest parts of winter, when the nights stretched longest, some even hosted dream feasts, small family gatherings where each person shared their most vivid dreams over warm broth and bread. Sleep was communal, yes, but dreaming could become entertainment. There is one tale recorded in the margins of a 12th century Welsh manuscript of a girl who dreamed the Virgin Mary sat beside her and combed her hair. When she awoke, a strand of silver had appeared in her braid. The family believed it a blessing. She never married, but lived long and peacefully, known as a dreamer, touched by grace. Not all dreams were gentle. There were tales of demons disguised as lovers, of black hounds with burning eyes, of rooms filling slowly with water while no one moved. These too were accepted, catalogued, interpreted. Dreams were data, in a way. A medieval psychology, before psychology had a name. Then, of course, there were nights when no one dreamed. Nights when war loomed. Nights when famine thinned the walls between wake and dream. Nights when candles burned low and parents told children to sleep quickly because soldiers might come. Even in sleep, history pressed close, but still they slept. With prayers, with songs, with stories, and always the whispering wind outside. There's still more to uncover beneath the quilt of medieval slept the stars. The omens, the quiet turning of the heavens above, people who believed that everything, even rest, had meaning. Because to a medieval mind, the night sky wasn't just beautiful, it was a calendar, clock, and a message board from the divine. And sleep. Sleep was deeply affected by what happened in the heavens. The phases of the moon were thought to shape dreams. A waxing moon, they believed, brought more vivid visions, sometimes prophetic. A full moon could disturb sleep entirely, especially in children or the ill. It was during these nights, people said, that the soul wandered farthest from the body. That's why it was common in certain parts of Europe to pull curtains tight across windows during a full moon to keep the moonlight from stealing the soul. As one 13th century herbalist warned, the moon wasn't the only influence. Astrologers often claim that your birth sign determined not just your personality, but your sleep habits. A person born under Pisces, for instance, was thought to be a deep dreamer. Someone born under Aries might sleep restlessly, tossing from side to side. In royal courts, court astrologers advised kings and queens when it was safest to sleep after illness, or how to interpret strange dreams based on the positions of Saturn or Venus. Even physicians took the stars seriously. A 15th century English medical book instructed that to sleep under the sign of Scorpio was dangerous for women expecting children. Another warned against sleeping on your left side when Mars was in retrograde, lest the heart be burdened with melancholy. It may sound fanciful now, but back then, the sky and the body were thought to mirror each other. If the stars were chaotic, so too would be your dreams. And if dreams were troubling, so might your fate be. Which brings us to something stranger still. There were times were rare, but real when sleep itself was used to determine innocence. It was called the sleeping test. In some isolated medieval communities, if a person was suspected of a crime, but lacked witnesses to prove guilt or innocence, the local priest or elder might declare a divine trial of rest. The accused would be made to lie on a cold floor, often on stone or straw, with only a thin cloth. Sometimes herbs would be burned around them, and a holy relic placed nearby. If they could fall asleep before dawn, deep, true sleep, proven by their breathing and stillness, they were considered innocent. For who but the innocent could find peace under such pressure? But if they tossed, turned, or sweat a diff, their eyes fluttered or they cried out, it was seen as a sign of guilt or demonic possession. It was rare, often controversial, but it happened. There's a record from 1341 of a young man accused of theft in Burgundy. With no one to defend him, he was subjected to the silent night. He passed, slept soundly. A year later, the real thief confessed on his deathbed, and the villagers remembered. Of course, not everyone trusted sleep to tell the truth. Some feared what sleep revealed. That's why certain dreams were kept secret, especially if they involved forbidden love, visions of power, or blasphemy. There's a diary of a nun in 1279 who dreamed repeatedly of a great book flying toward her in the night. When it opened, she heard a voice that said, "You must write what you see." She told no one, wrote nothing. But later, when a younger nun reported the same dream, the abbess declared it a divine order. The older nun was given a pen and parchment. What she wrote filled 3 volumes: dreams of saints, of cities on fire, of skies raining stars. Her writing was preserved, but her name was forgotten. Not all dreams brought comfort. Some are seen as punishment. In the penitentials, the rule books of sin and confession, there are entire sections devoted to the dreams of the lustful, the violent, the gluttonous. Monks were instructed to confess even their dreams if they seemed too sinful, because to dream of sin, they believed, meant that a part of you still clung to it. Some monks, desperate to rid themselves of temptation, tied cords around their legs at night, or slept on planks of wood with no padding. Pain, they believed, would purify their rest. Others turned to sacred objects, pieces of the true cross, bones of saints, little fragments of cloth said to have touched Christ's tomb, hoping these relics would anchor them in holiness as they slept. And still others fasted, hoping that an empty stomach would yield purer dreams. But even in these strict settings, sleep brought rebellion. There were monks who stole extra naps behind curtain partitions, novices who wrote their dreams in secret, with symbols to hide their meaning. Even abbots who confessed, late in life, to visions that had haunted them since youth, because dreams once born could not be banished. They lived on, echoing in the quiet, scratched into parchment, shared in whispers. And in every corner of medieval life, from the cradle to the cloister, from the watchtower to the bed of a queen's, sleep remained a mystery, a sacred pause, a nightly surrender, a doorway. And so we return to that first idea, that sleep wasn't boring at all. It was full of rules, full of drama, full of magic, belief, and fear. It was shaped by stars and saints, by weather and whispers, by what you ate, what you feared, and who lay beside you. So we drift into those final hours of the medieval night when the fire has burned to coals, the shutters tremble faintly in the wind, and dawn begins to color the edge of the sky with a hush of pale silver. This is the hour before waking. Not quite night, not quite morning, a space in between. For the devout, this was the hour of lauds, the sacred praise sung just before sunrise. Bells echoed across cloisters and hillsides, calling monks from their straw pallets. With red-rimmed eyes and stiff limbs, they rose without complaint, murmuring prayers even as they dressed in the cold. Outside monastery walls, others stirred for different reasons. In village kitchens, women rose first, not just to stretch, but to work. The bread had to be made. The ovens warmed, child fed. Perhaps in this soft hour, she allowed herself one moment by the hearth. Eyes half-lidded, watching the first faint glow gather in the east. Sleep, after all, was over.
Ow.
But its weight still lingered. This was when dreams were remembered, or deliberately forgotten. Medieval people believed that dreams told before breakfast carried power. To speak of them too soon might make them real. And so, many kept their silence in these early moments, staring into the embers, turning the memory of strange visions over in their minds like secret stones. A knight might rise stiffly from his feathered bed, armor waiting near the wall. Did he dream of blood, of wolves, of falling? He wouldn't say. But he'd look at the sky, the same way his ancestors had, and wonder. Shepherds stepped into the frost-bitten air, breath curling into mist, eyes blinking against the gloom. Horses whinnied. Dogs stretched. And somewhere nearby, a church bell gave a single, lonely chime. For the poor, there was little time to linger. The waking hour was labor. And yet some still paused. There were morning prayers spoken under the breath, herbs crushed and tied to belts, charms kissed before being tucked away. The spell of the night was breaking but gently. In the cities, early merchants began to open their stalls. The cobblestones still wet with dew, a beggar stirred beneath a cart. Somewhere a child turned over in her sleep, her mother already gone to fetch water. And so it went, this slow unraveling of night. The second sleep ended, not with an alarm, not with urgency, but with routine, with rhythm, with light slipping across floorboards and faces. This final hour was often the most peaceful, before the clamor of the day began, before carts and hooves and arguments and firewood being split. It was an hour where, if one listened closely, the world seemed to breathe, to exhale. Even in castles, waking was a ceremony. Servants would enter in silence, drawing curtains, warming cloths, presenting wine or water. The lord or lady would sit up slowly, allowing sleep to fall from them like a second skin. Perhaps they'd speak of a dream, or demand that it be interpreted. There were books for that too. One or critical books of dream interpretation still survived in these centuries. Some were passed down from ancient Greece, translated, copied, and re-illustrated by medieval scribes. They told the reader what it meant to dream of birds, of water, of falling teeth. These books were kept close to beds like companions, and even kings consulted them, because sleep was not forgotten once morning came. It lingered in thought, in fear, in curiosity. And often, people longed for more of it. That's why naps were common, even expected. The meridian of midday rest was taken by both monks and farmers alike. In the heat of the afternoon, when the sun was high and labor slowed, people lay down again. On benches, on sacks, in stables, on grass. It wasn't laziness, it was survival. And this, too, was part of the medieval sleep cycle. Rest came in pieces, for hours here, an hour there, a stolen nap before vespers. Sleep was not a block but a patchwork. The modern idea of 8 straight hours would have seemed unnatural. To them, it wasn't sleep that needed to be ordered. It was life that needed to yield to sleep. Because sleep was a gift, a danger, a divine passage, and it returned every night, whether invited or not. So in the final hours of medieval night, as candles flickered out and shutters were unlatched, people stepped from darkness into light, carrying with them the dreams of saints, of demons, of skies filled with falling stars. And as their feet touched the earth, they did not forget the mysteries of sleep. They had lived inside them. And soon, when the sun set again, they would return to the straw. to the featherbed, to the silence, to the whisper of lullabies and the slow beating of their own hearts. And once again they would surrender, to sleep, to night, to everything it held. Even as the final echoes of the medieval night fade into morning light, the story of sleep never really ends. It only slips, quietly, into another rhythm, waiting patiently until darkness falls again. Because every night in every age, people return to their beds, and whether they lie on feather mattresses or straw pallets, beneath downy quilts or threadbare cloaks, whether they sleep in solitude or beside family, animals or strangers, one thing remains the same. They surrender to sleep, to dreams, to whatever lies beyond the veil of waking. And perhaps that's what ties us so deeply to those long-ago sleepers. The medieval world may feel distant, trapped in superstition. It's candlelight and the echo of Latin prayers, but the need for sleep, and all the hopes and fears we tuck into it, is entirely human, entirely timeless. When a medieval mother whispered a prayer over her child's sleeping body, was she so different from a parent today tiptoeing out of a nursery? When a lonely monk struggled with dreams of temptation and guilt, was his turmoil so unlike the battles we wrestle beneath our own sheets? When a peasant gazed up at the stars, wondering if the moon would bring sweet dreams or haunting visions, was that longing, that vulnerability, any less real than the silent wishes we carry with us into every night? The details have changed. The world has changed. But sleep somehow remains pure. And history lives there too, in the hush of night, in the rituals and fears and comforts that shaped how people lay down to rest. So the next time you settle into your bed, whether it's in silence or with the hum of distant traffic or the low voice of a narrator telling you tales from centuries, past know that you not alone, not truly. Somewhere in some flickering memory of time, someone else is also lying down. They too feel the weight of fatigue, the ache of the day. They too pull a blanket around their shoulders, murmur a last thought, and drift slowly, softly into the deep. They too dream of gardens and ghosts, of saints and serpents, of things they'll never say aloud. And maybe, just maybe, one of their dreams is of you, is of a future world so fast, so bright, so strange, where people still close their eyes and listen to old stories to help them fall asleep. A voice is carried across time, someone, somewhere remembering them. So let the world fade for now. Let the fire burn low. Let the shutters be drawn. Let the air grow cool and still. And let the story settle over you like a second blanket. Because this is the gift of sleep. Not just rest, but return. Return to the mystery. Return to the self. Return to a time when people believed that even in sleep, they were part of something divine. Good night. Again. Sleep deep. Sleep well. And when you dream tonight, dream like the medievals did. With wonder, with fear, with faith. And above all, with the quiet hope that tomorrow the sun will rise again.